So, on this, our final episode, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy XIII. Who wants to give the introduction to Final Fantasy XIII? Becky, do you want to...
So, my notes are a pair of spider diagrams, one of which says what the game is, and the other of which says why it matters. And there is no overlap.
Yeah, that's kind of... Mine is my impressions of Final Fantasy XIII, and then the second is like... But what is Final Fantasy XIII as, like, an object? Or what's the Final Fantasy XIII other people think it is, kind of?
What's the meme and what's the reality?
Yeah, pretty much.
I realized, by this point 10 years ago, I had, capital G, capital I got into Final Fantasy. And that means that even though 13 didn't come out until early 2009, I've kind of been litigating this game for 10 years. Because I can remember getting hype over trailers and discussing with various people who had investments in different parts of the franchise what would be good and what wouldn't be good. And obviously it's not right to say it's dominated the conversation about JRPGs.
Yeah, I think probably a better term would be it's leached into the conversation about JRPGs.
Yeah, loomed over maybe.
It's symbolic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things, and games culture is really good at producing these, but they happen in every art form and every cultural process, where if you're in the space, you kind of have to have a take on it, right? You've got to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it happened by accident or by a fluke. There was, in kind of 2007-8, there was this new way of talking about games that came about because producing video for YouTube became accessible to people that previously wouldn't have been able to do any kind of video work, and new styles of talking about games generally came out of that, and some new games communities, communities in the technical sense of the term only, because they were horrendous places, but new games communities got started, and in a way it was a democratization. I'm thinking of places like The Escapist, for example, where suddenly it wasn't professional journalists writing, for their day job, who were talking about games and determining the rhetorics that we use about games. It was forums. There'd always been an element of that, but I think those structures rose to the fore all of a sudden.
It gave more of a legitimacy to forum arguments because they could put out YouTube videos and have just as much attention come onto them as mainstream journalists would get.
Yeah, which, the end result of that has been this thing now where, some gamer can throw a strop about a puddle in the new Spider-Man game, and it's headline news on all the old, professional gaming sites, because they don't really know how to decide what is and isn't newsworthy anymore.
I wouldn't understand how much of that was personality-driven. This is a time when Yahtzee was easily the most popular game critic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at Yahtzee's early videos, his 2007, 2008 videos, they're full of shots at JRPGs. He uses, Tidus and Varn as, again, an icon of a laughable tradition in game design. It's a visual gag several times. He just puts an image of Varn on screen, and that's the joke. And produces this way of talking that when FF13 comes out, it kind of happens to be really easy to fit into or to talk about in that way. What the game designers had decided to do in refocusing Final Fantasy on what they saw as its key elements. And there are interviews with the designers of 13 at the time where they talk about kind of stripping back and going back to basics. The basics they'd gone back to were exactly the things that were the kind of grain of truth in whatever it was Yahtzee was saying. Linearity, restrictiveness, turn-based combat where you stand waiting for your enemy to do things, those sorts of stuff. And yeah, it was kind of this collision of people being really trained to respond to games a particular way, or to a particular kind of game a particular way. And here's a really good instance of that particular kind.
There was, when the controversies happened, there was two demographics of people, I would say. There was the people who, in a way to put it simply, there's the people who worshipped Final Fantasy IX and took like Square Enix's lack of franchising is a slap in the face. And then, and that's like the big giant long Tim Rogers review or the Kotaku review that came out at the time. And then there is still your Yahtzee who just always treated these games as a joke, and that was just, that just happened to be in the mainstream right now. So like the biggest group was like these pile-ons or hanger-ons who didn't really have any stake in any of it at all. But like No Man's Sky is a recent example. It didn't matter if they had stake in it or not. They just, wanted a piece of something. Yeah. But then like I believe the media class of people, like it's not really a media class either. The personality class of people like Tim Rogers also fanned the flames by being persuasive and convincing that Final Fantasy has lost its way in their terms and in their views, because they were doing a mode of criticism that writes to Square Enix as like a responding body, a responsive body. Like, Square Enix, you're off the wrong path. But they were not writing to criticism that would address like developers or labor or who was actually making these games or why the games came to be. It's kind of just like, your taste is not matching up to my taste. What's going on?
We don't hear it as much as we used to, even like when we started this project, I think. But like the phrase black box got used a lot, right? About Japanese developers. So in that sense, the way that those personalities were responding to the Japanese industry was kind of yelling at these black boxes. Right, there was no attempt to break up the black box into like, oh, here's Hiroyuki Ito doing battle design, and what the significance of that was for the history. It's just Square Enix, and there is a utility to looking at Square Enix as a company, but also a company is only ever a black box from the outside. But yeah, I guess I've been collecting, and this is the start of the death of the JRPG. Right, it's where people start talking about the death of the JRPG, even though if you want to say, well, there was a drop-off in JRPG sales, that drop-off was well underway by 2009. This is where that rhetoric really gets started, and I've been collecting articles that say the JRPG is dead, or euphemistically say the JRPG is dead, for years now, and I've been trying to classify them according to kind of two different rhetorical pressures. One, which says that the problem with JRPGs is that they are obsolete, right? It's old-fashioned design. It's understood as a response to technical pressures and technical limitations that don't apply anymore. And so that's why JRPGs suck, because they're too rooted in the past. And then a kind of inverse or a complementary to that rhetoric is a rhetoric of abandonment, of like, modern JRPGs have lost touch with what made JRPGs great by abandoning the things that were the virtues. And what I've found is that most pieces make both of these arguments, even though they kind of can't both be true.
Yeah.
Like, you can't have a game that has abandoned its roots and is too close to its roots. But I think probably the roots that are abandoned and the roots that are too close to are being imagined as different sets of roots.
Mm-hmm.
But they're the same stuff. They just go together.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of like... And FF13 has some of that. Right, because people complain about the storytelling not being whatever is supposed to be good about the storytelling of FF6, and they complain about the mechanics.
Did people do that?
Yeah, God,
That's so
Yahtzee did that.
Fucking annoying. Just like, it's so obvious when you play 13. If it's paying homage to anything, it's Final Fantasy VII, and it does not care about Final Fantasy VI, and that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't gone back and checked because I'd vomit, but I think in Yahtzee's review of FF13, he started out by saying, "It might surprise you to learn that I was once a Final Fantasy fan. I really liked Final Fantasy VI."
Of course you did.
Wait, I mean, yeah, of course. He was also a big Earthbound fan, but like, that kind of contrast. And yeah, you're dead right. We'll get on to the relationship to Final Fantasy VII, I'm sure, because I've got some hollering to do. But, on the one hand, FF13 was kind of portrayed as like, well, whoever was doing good storytelling work at Square Enix isn't anymore because they're not there anymore, they've lost their way. And on the other hand, these mechanics were regarded as obsolete in some way, which that's completely ahistorical, because the mechanics of FF13 are an incredibly ambitious update of ATB.
Nothing plays like Final Fantasy XIII, period.
Yeah, absolutely nothing. And it's not a turn-based game. See my recent article.
Yeah.